Hello, friends and neighbors. Thank you for joining me today for another poem of the day. Today is Wednesday, August the 6th, 2025. And today will be, I think, our first poem in translation. We will be reading some French poetry today from 1871 is when this poem was written, and it was published in 1883. So 1871, it was written when the poet was 17 years old. And that seemed quite early to me when I was looking it up. Just early to be composing poetry, early to be composing poetry that is still around. And then I learned that the author retired from literature at age 20. And you probably at this point know that I'm referring to Arthur Rimbaud, or for the more French pronunciation, Arthur Rimbaud. And he was a bit of a restless spirit, such that his life and his stylings and his expression have taken on a bit of a cultural legacy of their own, where he's thought of as sort of a renegade and a wanderer, not just literally as he did travel a lot, but as a kind of restless spirit who was looking for ways to rebel and different forms of expression that were more ecstatic. He influenced people like Octavio Paz, Jim Morrison, Bob Dylan, Patti Smith, and died at a very young age, I think 37, from cancer. Rimbaud is part of the symbolist movement of poetry, which, to characterize broadly, means that his work was not as interested in explicit meanings, allegories, political points or associations like that. It was more meant to express sort of art for art's sake, right? If we can think more of someone like Oscar Wilde, who is not really a part of the symbolist movement in the sense that the symbolists are often relegated just to France, but Wilde is someone writing in English who's doing something very similar. And so the symbolists will be very interested in vivid imagery, in sound and devices like onomatopoeia. They often tried to write poetry that mimicked or imitated what they heard in and the emotional experience that they got out of music. And so a lot of their poetry feels somewhat dreamlike or feels somewhat phantasmagoric rather than literal or narrative. And I think that you'll see that in our poem today, which is called Vowels, is the translation. And the translation that I'll be reading was done in 2015 by George J. Dance. So this is Vowels by Arthur Rimbaud, translated by George J. Dance. Black A, white E, red I, green U, blue O. You vowels. Someday I'll tell the tale of where your mystery lies. Black A jacket formed of hairy, shiny flies that buzz among harsh stinks in the abyss's bowels. White E, the white of kings, of moon-washed fogs and tents, of fields of shivering cheverel, glaciers' gleaming tips. Red I, magenta, spat-up blood, the curl of lips, in laughter, hatred, or besotted penitence. Green U, vibrating waves in viridescent seas, or peaceful pastures flecked with beasts. Furrows of peace imprinted on our brows as if by alchemies. Blue O, great trumpet blaring strange and piercing cries through silences where worlds and angels pass crosswise. Omega, O, the violent brilliance of those eyes. So, this poem is separated by a distinct focus on each of the main vowels that appear in French. And it associates each vowel with a specific color. Then, as it names that color, it unfolds some associations that the speaker has with those colors, some of which I find common and some of which I find a bit strange and evocative. I was doing some reading on this poem, and I learned that this is one of the most written about poems in the French language from basically the time that it first appeared. It was also mocked and parodied of kind of being the scribblings of a child. And there's not really settled on interpretations of or analyses, which I think is appropriate given what we said before I read the poem about the symbolists. Claude Levi-Strauss is one who sees within it kind of a progression by way of opposites that Rimbaud chooses by associating black with A, white with E, red with I, green with U. That what he's doing is he's contrasting vowels in a way that we normally see again as sort of a linkage or a progression. So black and white are thought of as being polar opposites, and then the most chromatic color coming out of black and white, because black and white is the absence of color or the projection of all color, but the most chromatic one then is red. Red and green are contrasting opposites colors on the color wheel. So he was looking at that and then trying to figure out from a language standpoint what it would mean to contrast A with E, and then to stand I as being kind of the most chromatic of the vowels out of that. Others think that this is more of like a memory poem, that the author is going back in his memory to being a child, a very early memory, and perhaps placing blocks next to one another, and the way that we often teach kids phonetically about letters by P stands for plane, C stands for car, and so on. And so there's not really an association of symbol so much as there's an association of image. That black is the flies and the buzzing. So there's, again, that sound that the symbolists are going for there. White being here, not purity, which it's usually associated with, but regality of being placed with a king, or the gleaming tips of glaciers. The red eye that he then recasts in the translation as magenta, which seems somewhat softer to me, is then associated with blood. And the curl, blood can be passionate, blood can be rage-filled or anger. And then there's also kind of a contrasting image within the curl of the lips, whether it's from laughter or whether it's from anger or hatred, which is something that I think you can see when you look upon someone's face. Most of the time, we're able to construct what's going on in their mind. But when it's rendered into language, the curl of lips, we need sort of more information or more context to understand what affect is being portrayed there. I really liked what Dance did with the translation. I don't know how close this is to the original, but with the green U, and knowing that at least in Latin, U and V are associated very closely together. I mean, they're close together in the English alphabet, but that they, with their pronunciation, are pretty much merged together in Latin. So U, he then turns into vibrating waves in viridescent seas, and I really like the alliteration and the consonants that's in there. Also, viridescence is an interesting word because it suggests a becoming green rather than a status of green that's already there. So it kind of suggests that green carries with it a growth or a story within itself, that nothing is really ever green, but that green represents always a state of becoming. And then the alliteration is repeated right afterward. The peaceful pastures furrowed of peace imprinted, which is nice. And it says imprinted on our brows as if by alchemy. So again, we get this sense of a transformation going on there, with alchemy being taking normal objects like metals and trying to make them into gold. So green carries for the writer an association of a transformation. Um, I also think there's an interesting tension within peaceful pastures flecked with beasts. So it's peaceful pastures, but then the placement of the beasts in it is almost kind of randomly dotted, um, like little flakes. And the choice of beasts, while it's a biblical word that's often just associated with mammals, within at least a more contemporary context, it has a um, suggestion of uncivility or savagery or something like that. Um, and then the end seems almost to me prophetic or apocalyptic. We get the sound of a trumpet, which appears in Revelation announcing the end of times, which pierces, cries through silences where worlds of angels pass crosswise. It's then called the Omega, which again we think of within a biblical context of Alpha and the Omega. And the blue is then finally the violet brilliance of those eyes. And he could be speaking to a lover or about someone for whom he has affection, or it could be these kind of brilliant blue eyes of like the coming of some god at the end. Um, and again, I think it's interesting that it's associated with violet, which is not blue. It's tangentially related to blue, but we have again kind of a transformation that if he continued going on here, he might start talking about vowel combinations or color combinations. So as you can see, there's a lot of strange imagery and sounds and associations that one can make with the poem, even if it's very hard to pin down, and even if it feels um, a bit feisty, or it feels a bit unruly, or maybe even a bit kind of simple or elementary. I think it's deceptive in that way, and I really appreciated how just kind of playful this poem is. So that's our first journey into the French symbolists and to Rimbaud in particular. Um, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and may peace be with you all today.